the love of strangers. I think a lot of poetry begins as a secret and covert activity. I mean, back in the day, as they say, there was the existence of the diary. And the diary was a little book of blank pages, and it was thought that at a certain age, young girls went up to their rooms and had feelings. Boys were too busy throwing stones at squirrels and doing what they do to have these feelings. And one feature of these diaries is that they had they had locks on them and a little key. And the lock was usually in the shape of a heart, a little golden heart. Why? Because these were your feelings you were expressing. That's the heart shape. Why the lock? Well, they were private. You didn't want God forbid, your big brother should look into your diary. You might say, cutting ahead, that poems are the expressions of thoughts and feelings, but they're no longer embarrassing. So poetry is sort of a diary without the lock, a diary that you want people to read. But when one is conjuring an audience, one has to admit that it's an audience of strangers, the strangers that, as Angel said, you want to fall in love with you. There's a way to get readers interested. And the way, and we'll talk about this expansively, I think, during this class, the way is through form. And by form, I mean anything that keeps the poem together. In a sonnet, the fact that it's a tight 14 lines, has a certain rhyme scheme, certain meter, also a certain subject. All of those are the glue that's keeping this object of language object together. Because the reader comes to your book of poems, not because the reader is interested in you, the reader is indifferent to you. The reader comes to the book of poems because the reader loves poetry. Now, in order to make a connection with the reader, what you have to do in your poetry is tell a little white lie. Harmless, but it's a lie. And the lie is that you love poetry more than you love yourself. We know that's not true. But if you can give that impression to the reader, so the reader picks up your book and sees that you're giving off evidence that you love poetry through form, then the reader's interest overlaps with yours. The reader's interest of poetry sees someone else interested in poetry and not just in self-expression. Yeats said, all that is personal will rot if it is not packed in ice and salt. Now, ice and salt would be the preservatives in Yeats's day, late 19th century, early 20th century. And he didn't say this, but I'm sure by ice and salt he meant rhyme and meter. Those were the preservatives that kept poetry together for centuries. Anything that, as I said, that's keeping the poem from falling apart, or keeping it from the words from just drifting out from each other as they would in outer space in a gravityless atmosphere, that would be considered form. It becomes a container for self-expression, and it has a shot. Then your poem has a shot of pleasing readers and making some of them fall in love with you. Poetry occupies a discrete place on the page, right? And if you think of all the white stuff around the poem, around the body of it and between the stanzas and all that, think of that as silence. So the poem is a displacement of silence. Prose is a continuation of noise. I'm kidding a little bit. Poetry then has a shape. And most lyric poems, you can see the whole thing, and they take 43 seconds to read. So that's the shapeliness of poetry. We just start with the look of it. Says a lot about why it's different from prose. And of all the definitions of poetry, and we can talk about the implications of some of them, The only airtight definition of poetry is by a poet named Henry Taylor, who says that a poem is an arrangement of lines whose length is determined by some principle other than the width of the page. In other words, lines in poetry don't go out to the end, they turn back. And when every line does not go out to the end of the page, it turns you back into the poem. So the poem is always recirculating your attention. The poem is saying, come back in here, get back in here. This is the body of the poem. I'm telling you to get back into this body. And it keeps recirculating your attention and into this compressed thing of the poem. The title is the welcome mat. The title is the marquee outside the movie theater, telling you it's playing inside, more or less. A title can be long and explanatory, but I wouldn't try to sum up the poem in the title. Or, I mean, if you come up with a title like the temptation of anxiety, well, I guess that's what the poem is going to be about, the temptation of anxiety. And what is that anyway? But I don't know if a reader wants to go forward with that because it's too dense a title. For my part, I think titles should either be really simple, like Monday or Tuesday, Snow on Pine Trees. It shouldn't draw too much attention to itself or be puzzling. It should just create access to the first few lines. The first few lines of the poem should contain something that is easy to accept. Like, I'm sitting here looking at this cherry tree. The reader can't reject that, unless he has something allergic to cherry trees. But the situation of the poet, you might have all this content about a death in the family or something, but instead of starting big with that and saying elegy to my mother, start with the setting of where you are. I'm on a porch now. It's late summer, and the dog is lying out under a hammock. Just a little scene that anybody could get, like in Hemingway or Chekhov. And once seduction is a kind of powerful word, but that is a seductive device because you're dangling a little scenery in front of the reader's eyes. And that's what fiction writers do all the time. They start by, it was a cold and snowy night. So getting a reader in by creating a little scene is a very good way to get them on board, and making very few demands in the beginning. The demands will come later. Once the reader commits to the poem, and the first couple of stanzas should allow the reader in by taking the reader by the hand, should be nothing heavy, nothing confusing about it. Then you close the door behind the reader and you, and then you have the reader inside. And then things can get wiggy. They can go in different directions. There can be a metaphoric play. There can be imaginative shifts that are going on, and the reader is kind of stuck with you at that point and probably still interested. I think a good serviceable analogy is the eye chart you find when you go to have your eyes examined. So usually there's a big E at the top, about this big, and that's for everyone to see. And then the letters become smaller and smaller and less legible. And then the doctor knows what kind of glasses you need. So I don't mean the poem should move into complete illegibility, but I think the E stands for anyone can see that, we hope. And so the E gets into it, gets the reader into the poem, and then the poem can be harder to get than that E as the poem goes along. It can move into realms of ambiguity and ambivalence and more complex feeling. And it even might, in some poems, bring the poet to the brink of the unsayable, where language just kind of does not serve anymore. and it breaks down. The syntax breaks down. It's like Dante in the Paradiso, where he has a vision of God, and there's no way to express it except through the metaphor of light. But it's sort of a stumbling into these metaphors because the poem now has gone from I'm sitting here looking at a cherry tree into some realm about balancing the balance between life and death in our minds, and how these two powers keep exerting pressure on us, something quite powerful. When I start a poem, I write in sentences, and I haven't found a better way to express thoughts or feelings. Tell me if you come up with something better. But after I write the first sentence, I assume that will be a stanza. So if it took 4 lines to get that out, I have a 4-line stanza called a quatrain. And then I will impose that on I'll say, well, just try to write another quatrain. So now I have another thing to do, but it's a self-imposed thing to do. I have to write good lines. Now I have to write 4-line stanzas, and not just run them all together, I don't think, but have each stanza kind of a standalone stanza. Well, if I write 3 of these quatrains and then the poem is just bridling against them and it's too boxy or it's too formal for the tone of the poem, then I'll let it go. I'll say, well, maybe it should be in 3-line stanzas. Or if the poem doesn't even want to be under that minimal kind of control, I'll just give up and say, we'll just have stanzas of unequal length. And stanza roughly means room in Italian. So you're really taking the reader on a tour of the poem room by room, like taking someone through your house and describing it. So that's a simple way to impose order on your poem. Sometimes it's hard to know where a line ends, but I think the basic thing is if you think about the grammar of the poem and how the sentences are divided, and to bring the line into some kind of agreement with that, unless you have a better reason, you don't want to break a line. Like you don't want to say the whiskers of line break the cat. I mean, you don't want, it's unprofitable to wait for the word cat. And so that's attention getting. And once you start breaking lines at very odd places, your reader is going to be distracted and wonder, why is she doing that? Why is he doing that? So if you have no better reason, I think letting the lines form the progress of the reader that agrees somewhat or reflects the syntax of the sense or the meaning of the sentence that's being written. This is a poem of mine in which there is there's just one stanza, and it's about a waterfall. And I decided pretty early on that since waterfalls don't have stanzas or any kind of break, they're a continuous motion, that I would just have one stanza. It's not that often that the stanza decision is a mimetic version of the subject you're writing about, but it seemed counterintuitive if you want to give the rhythm of this waterfall, the rhythm of this water, to kind of break it into stanzas. And the poem Elk River Falls is following a falls and seeing where it goes. Elk River Falls. Elk River Falls is where the Elk River falls from a rocky and considerable height, turning pale with trepidation at the lip, it seemed, from where I stood below, before it is unbuckled from itself and plummets shredded through the air into the shadows of a frigid pool, so calm around the edges, a place for water to recover from the shock of falling apart and coming back together, before it picks up its song again, goes sliding around some massive rocks, and past some islands overgrown with weeds, then flattens out and slips behind a bend and continues on its winding course, according to this camper's guide.